All right, let's jump right into this. If you really want to understand the incredibly tense, modern standoff between the US and Israel on one side and Iran and Palestinian groups on the other, we have to look way past the daily headlines. In this explainer, we're unpacking the hard data, literally everything from ancient genomes to modern public opinion polls, to figure out what's actually driving the threat of preemptive military strikes in the Middle East right now. So, how do ancient DNA, domestic polling, and international law all intersect to shape this conflict? It's a massive question, I know. To answer it, we're going to zoom all the way out to deep genetic history and then pull right back into today's most dangerous military standoffs. We'll look at the actual ancestral ties of people in the Levant, how Iran pushes its ideology globally, what the Iranian people actually believe behind closed doors, and finally, whether international law even justifies the US and Israel threatening military strikes on Iran's nuclear program. To make sense of all this, we've broken our roadmap down into 5 key areas, starting with ancient DNA and ending with United Nations law. Let's get to it. Starting off with our first section, we're looking at the DNA and Levantine origins of the people involved. A huge focal point in understanding this conflict is the intense debate over indigeneity. Essentially, do Jews in Israel descend more or less from the ancient inhabitants of the land than Palestinians do? Well, the genetic data actually reveals a really complex but crystal clear picture. Extensive DNA research shows us that the old myth of a total population replacement in antiquity, it's just entirely false. The people who farmed the land of ancient Judea largely stayed right there. In fact, modern Palestinians show roughly 80 to 90% direct genetic continuity with Bronze Age Canaanite DNA. On the flip side, Ashkenazi Jews, who make up the largest Jewish community worldwide and are a massive demographic in Israel, show about 37 to 65% Levantine ancestry, with the rest being Southern European admixture from centuries living in the diaspora. So, what science is telling us is that the modern descendants of the ancient Judeans heavily include the Arab populations of the Levant, who simply changed their religion to Christianity and then later to Islam over hundreds and hundreds of years. And this perfectly captures the tragic irony of this entire conflict. Both populations hold scientifically validated, deeply indigenous roots to the exact same soil. The biological lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't just vanish, it branched out. Understanding this shared genetic heritage is absolutely crucial because it completely reframes the territorial dispute from a purely scientific standpoint. Okay, so while the Levant is grappling with these incredibly ancient roots, let's look at our second section, which focuses on a much more recent ideological force trying to reshape the region. Ever since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran really hasn't operated like a normal, traditional nation-state. They operate as a revolutionary cause. Article 154 of Iran's constitution formally commits the country to ideological expansion beyond its borders. This is what's known as Khomeiniism. It's a radical Islamist ideology fusing religion and government right under a supreme leader. Their explicit goal? To export this anti-Western Islamic model globally, supporting various proxy groups across the Middle East to establish regional dominance and actively push back against the US and Israel. Just look at this quote. It perfectly demonstrates how Iran's leadership originally framed their entire nation. Ayatollah Khomeini saw education and propaganda as the core engines of a mission to spread this communist ideology. They were and are effectively trying to Islamify global governance by getting populations to rise up against Western-aligned systems. This ideological expansion is, without a doubt, a massive driver of the conflict we see today. But here is where things get really fascinating. Moving into Section 3, let's look at the actual polling reality inside Iran today. We hear all this talk about the regime's goals for global Islamification, right? But how strict are these religious realities on the ground for everyday Iranians? Well, a massive 2020 survey by Gaman shows that the regime's strict religious image is being actively, heavily defied by its own citizens. Get this, only 32.2% of Iranians actually identify as Shiite Muslim. Meanwhile, a whopping 22.2% identify as having none for their religious affiliation. Others identify as atheists, spiritual, Zoroastrian, or Sunni. It is a stunning amount of religious diversity. And the sheer scale of this secular shift is just massive. Nearly half the population, 47%, reported transitioning from being religious to non-religious over their lifetime. This is a deeply, deeply transformed society that is actively pulling away from the state-mandated religious framework. So what does this all mean? This huge ideological disconnect has resulted in roughly 70% of Iranians actively opposing the continuation of the Islamic Republic today.
They are demanding a democratic, secular alternative. So you have the Iranian government aggressively exporting a radical religious revolution abroad, while simultaneously bleeding religious legitimacy at home.
Now, let's bring it back to the immediate geopolitics in Section 4, focusing on the Begin Doctrine.
Let's look at the immediate consequences of all these forces. The major standoff between the US and Israel on one side and Iran's nuclear program on the other. Driven by extreme geopolitical vulnerability and geographic asymmetry, keep in mind, Iran is over 70 times larger than Israel. Israel leadership relies on something called the Begin Doctrine. Because the Iranian regime openly and repeatedly calls for Israel's destruction, Israel uses its conventional military superiority to justify high-risk preemptive containment strategies. And this is a posture that the United States frequently supports.
The US and Israel have calculated that they simply cannot allow a regime with Iran's stated ideological goals to reach a nuclear point of no return. This intense fear is exactly what leads to the very real, ongoing threat of the US or Israel executing preemptive military strikes to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities. And just to be completely clear here, we are talking about conventional weapons targeting nuclear infrastructure, not launching a nuclear weapon at Iran. But still, even a conventional strike on these targets triggers an absolute firestorm of debate within the global legal community.
Which brings us to our final section, international law and defense. Let's see how the law actually handles this. When the US or Israel threatens a military strike to stop Iran's nuclear program, is that actually legal? Well, the legal framework for self-defense is super strict, mostly governed by Article 51 of the UN Charter. Traditionally, a state can only use force if an armed attack has already happened. Some interpretations do allow for strikes if an attack is provably, undeniably imminent. Because of this really tight wording, legal scholars are deeply, fiercely divided on whether preemptive strikes against nuclear facilities are allowed. On one side, you have legal scholars arguing that without an imminent, highly verifiable attack, preemptive strikes are just a blatant violation of international law, period. From their point of view, since Iran doesn't currently have a nuclear weapon to launch, any US or Israeli military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities is technically an act of unlawful aggression. It's not self-defense. But on the flip side, others argue that this strict legal formalism completely ignores reality. They argue you simply cannot apply standard UN rules to a theocratic regime that literally embeds the destruction of another state into its core ideology. The argument here is that if Iran possesses a nuclear weapon, it acts as this massive nuclear shield, which would allow them to launch conventional attacks via their proxies with total impunity. Therefore, they argue a preemptive military strike by the US or Israel is absolutely a justified, necessary defense against an existential threat. So is the threat of a preemptive strike actually justified? As an explainer, we aren't here to declare which side of international law is right, but rather to show you exactly why this justification is so incredibly contested. Ultimately, the answer depends entirely on whether you prioritize the strict, formal text of the UN Charter or the pragmatic, existential fear of a regime dedicated to exporting radical ideology. And I want to leave you with this final thought. Understanding the deep science of who actually belongs to the land, the rapidly secularizing demographics inside Iran, and the rigid limits of international law, that is truly the only way to grasp the gravity of tomorrow's headlines. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.